Welcome to the first episode of the Historical Materialism Podcast, HM for short. I'm Ashok Kumar.
And I'm Lucas Lothus.
What we're trying to do with this podcast is a kind of long form, deep dive analysis into a particular area of Marxist thinking based around the Historical Materialism Journal. The idea is to go beyond sort of bite sized explainers and take as long as we need to do the task of introducing and demystifying a particular Marxist theory and debate, but also try to get into the kind of granular detail of a specific intervention by sitting down with contributors and critics in the latest HM journal. We'll also try and make the article or articles we discuss open access. And we'll be doing at least one podcast for every new issue of the journal, which is quarterly. For our introductory podcast, our guests include three journal editorial board members, alongside one of the contributors to the Political Marxism Symposium in issue 29.3, which is what we're looking at today. So would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Rob Knox, and I'm a member of the HM editorial boards.
Hi, I'm Maya Powell, and I'm also a member of the editorial board and set up, the symposium.
Hi, I'm Svenja Bromberg, and I'm also a member of the editorial board of HM.
Hi, I'm Javier Moreno Zacares, and I contributed to the symposium.
Thanks. Since some listeners might not know what historical materialism, the institution, is, Svenja, can you give us a little bit of a history of HM, what it is, what it does?
Yeah. It's a difficult task. It's become a big, big project over the years. For many of the listeners, probably I don't even need to introduce HM. They've probably interacted with it in one or another ways. I'm myself a rather recent member of the editorial board, but I'll try my best. And if Rob or Maya want to add something, please do. So I think HM is firstly, but by no means only, an academic journal. It started in 1997 and is now published 4 times a year in print and online through Brill. And incidentally, I was looking back at the first issue, and actually Alan Meixenswood and Benno Teschke were both published in the very first issue. So our conversation today goes back in a way to the roots of the journal. The journal has an editorial board with currently 19 members, as well as a corresponding editorial board with far more. And as an academic journal, I would say it's quite a special place because we have monthly, sometimes heated intellectual and political debates about all the issues. And so these debates are really the core work that we do at the journal. But again, HM is more than the journal. I, for example, was introduced to HM, I think, firstly through the London conference, meeting our kind of HM community there. There's a yearly London conference. There are now yearly or regular conferences around the globe, and that is part of the work of HM. Then there's a book series that is published by Brill and Haymarket, where the book series publishes new scholarship as well as classical or important translations into English of key Marxist scholarship. And finally, there's a website with a lively blog. There are global event announcements. So in general, the website is also a kind of place for Marxist debate.
So, political Marxism was and is an attempt to challenge a perceived structuralist bias in Marxist accounts of history, which focus on the logic of capitalism, abstracted from specific historical events and the social agents which or who bring about social change. So, political Marxism focuses on the historical break that led to the transition from feudalism to capitalism, explaining how this transition happened in England first without taking place in other countries with a similar set of structural conditions. So Robert Brenner shows how historical events and contextual specificity lead to different modes of production in Western and Eastern Europe. So in Western Europe led to capitalism, in Eastern Europe led to serfdom, despite similar processes of intensification of commerce and trade. So Brenner and political Marxists more generally focus on class struggle as central rather than kind of axiomatic ideas of how capitalism behaves. And by emphasizing historical context and the importance of what they call social property relations, along with the ways class struggles take place in different locations, Brenner's key point was to show that the peculiar legal form of the enclosures in England replaced subsistence farming with market-based farming, allowing landlords to pit peasants against each other through competition over access to leaseholds on the land. So this enclosure system exposed peasants to dispossession if they were unable to adapt to constantly rising rents, and thereby profit became the condition of their social reproduction. And this squeezed out the less productive and less successful peasants and rewarded the more productive and more successful peasants. So by creating a market for land and a market for labor, landlords could hire peasants as wage laborers and were pressured to invest in labor-saving technology and capital-saving technologies in order to maintain their profits because of this increasing competition. And this led to increasing market dependence and therefore marks the beginning of capitalism, according to the political Marxists. So in short, the particular balance of forces between classes in England is what led to the emergence of capitalism and didn't lead to the emergence of capitalism at the same time in, for example, France, which had otherwise similar levels of development of the economic system. So both lords and peasants become dependent on the market, and this then highlights, the political Marxists use this to highlight the importance of political struggle, class struggle, and the particular political constitution of labor as absolutely central to understanding capitalism. So the legal form under which labor is exploited becomes really important, and so it's a political Marxism because it really emphasizes the importance of political conflict and struggle along class lines, and how that plays a role in the emergence of capitalism.
Great, thanks, Lucas and Ashok. It's really fun to be here, and I'm really glad to be launching this podcast, which hopefully is going to introduce a new era and really launch HM into the 21st century properly. So I'm really excited about this, and I'm also obviously really excited to be talking about the symposium, which has basically been 2 years in the making now. It's been something we've been discussing a while, and there was a panel at the 2019 HM conference in London, where the pieces, some of the contributions were discussed, and since then we thought, okay, let's try and publish this and get some more people on board into the journal, and it's been a really great journey to be on, and I'm just really proud and excited to be now seeing it in print and seeing it as a full issue. So yeah, I'm going to try and basically give a 101 intro on what is political Marxism and how it tackles some of the key questions that I guess some of our listeners will be interested in, and the kind of stuff that we try and promote through our work. And I'm going to try and tackle this a bit through thinking about, well, what is capitalism? Basically, how do political Marxists tackle that kind of big question? A good way to start this is to say, well, capitalism is not just about greedy profit making, right? It's a complex system. It's about the social reproduction of human beings, their survival, which is based on the production of goods and services for profit, obviously, but also on the production of labor power, right, as a commodity. So the work that we all do. And to survive on a very basic level, and this is kind of a bit how I introduce all this to my students, right? Human beings have to work, they have to offer themselves on the job market so as to get money and buy goods and services, etc., from other markets. So market dependence is essential, and here we come to kind of a key point about political Marxism that, especially in its early days, was used to differentiate it from other Marxisms, I guess. And not only market dependence is essential for capitalism to set itself in place, but it's actually imperative, right? So if people can get food, if they can trade, if they can survive by other means through access to a market, then in a sense, we're not in a purely or dominantly capitalist system, right? So there's something unique about capitalism, and the whole point, or I guess, of political Marxism was to intervene in the kind of 80s, from kind of late 80s onwards, to try and establish, well, what is unique about this system? It's not something that's always been there. It's not a natural and inevitable process. It's something that, you know, has specific historical origins, and that we have to do the tough historical work of really pinning down what those origins are, right? So that unique system requires a dispossession of peoples from their common means of survival, their separation from the means of production, right, which is what Marx obviously started from, but more specifically, what political Marxists will then try and look at is the specific political and economic processes through which that dispossession occurred, right? So Robert Brenner and Alan Wood kind of been associated as the founders of political Marxism. It's not a label they chose. They actually didn't really like it, but it was given to them by an opponent in the debates they were having at the time, Guy Debord, and it stuck, and it's kind of, for better or worse, with us. So, you know, obviously there are many other things we could say about what is capitalism and its origins. And I'm not going to go into a kind of really long history about that. And maybe we can come back to some of these elements later on in our discussion. But I guess what's important for political Marxists is to not assume that this system is a given, that it's fixed, and that it just drops out of the sky. It's a contested process. It's a process that's politically constituted and contested. And we need to think about what it is and to explain it in relation to what they saw as very problematic fallacies or movements in the Marxism of the post World War II period. So the issues of economic determinism and issues of structuralism. Right, so two big debates that political Marxism kind of sets itself up as trying to get rid of in the 80s. And so these two issues of structuralism and economic determinism led Robert Brenner, but also Alan Wood, more theoretically, to kind of lay out a different approach that use different concepts to some extent. We'll talk about social relations of production, for example, social property relations, as you know, as opposed to social relations of production, as a key political Marxist concept. And so some key themes that Alan Wood worked on, so the separation of the political and economic, the relationship between base and superstructure, the mode of production, what it means to take a kind of practical theoretical stance. Alan Wood was a very prolific writer, and she wrote on all sorts of topics and issues, and she really tried to kind of make all this stuff more accessible and to think more practically about all of these issues while being very rigorous historically and theoretically. So there's an aim in political Marxism to come back to history, to come back to specificity, to locate the origins of capitalism in a particular context, and to basically focus on social property relations as an ensemble of social relations, right, as a whole, and not just as this political economic relationship. So that's been a really key starting point. And I guess to kind of try and introduce a bit the symposium and hopefully bring in other people in here now is to think of where the debate is at today. And the symposium was an idea of, you know, talking about new debates in political Marxism, where we've got to up to now, what's the new work being written on these issues. And there's a debate going on now about how still structuralist maybe some of the political Marxist work is. So we have Ben Oteshka and Sam Nafo, who wrote an article a few years ago saying that basically Brenner and Wood had structuralist elements in their thought, and that was being reproduced through the work of those who took on the concept of rules of reproduction. So we'll try and maybe explain that a bit later. So some people in the debate are saying rules of reproduction are a key concept. We need to stick to it. There are structural elements to the reproduction of capitalism that we need to explain and hold on to, whereas on the other side, Sam Nafo and Ben Oteshka, and to some extent others, take on a more radical historicist perspective, and they say, well, basically we need to really try and rid ourselves of any structural methods in our approach to the analysis of capitalism.
Thanks for that. Javier, do you want to give us your contribution, please?
Yeah, I'll just pick it up from where Maya left off, I think. So basically, Sam Nafo and Ben Oteshka's argument in the symposium is that political Marxism has become less political and more structural over time, so to speak. Which is to say that since the Brenner thesis, political Marxism has lost a certain sensitivity towards historical analysis. And their claim is that political Marxism has come to look at history through abstract theoretical models and generic structural patterns at the expense of examining how history is shaped by institutional contexts and the outcomes of social conflict, right? So for them, by doing this, political Marxism has given up its original focus on concrete analysis of social property relations, and instead has come to rely on vacuous structural generalities, and they cite the concept of market dependence as an example of these vacuous generalities. So now I have followed this debate pretty much since the beginning, not quite as Maya, but almost there, and I've seen it play out in successive HM conferences and other events. And of course, Nafo and Teshke mentored me into political Marxism. So this debate has been quite formative for my way of thinking about political Marxism. However, over the years, I think I've come to see the debate as stuck in an unhelpful place. And I think that part of the problem is how Nafo and Teshke themselves decided to formulate their critique of contemporary political Marxism, right? Which I think now needs some qualification. So basically, this is what I try to do with my article in the symposium, to sort of try to reformulate the terms of the debate and sort of frame the discussion slightly differently in ways that I think are more productive. So my contribution basically makes 3 points. The first point is that I agree that there is an epistemic divide in political Marxism, but that it is not. I think it's not as extreme as Nafo and Teshke make it out to be. Right. I also think it's not about the tired question of structure and agency, which is how they frame it, but rather it is about historical method. Right. So I think that the question that they're really raising is about how we should approach and theorize historical patterns without falling into some sort of ahistorical determinism, right? So for me, the divide within political Marxism is then not so much between structuralism and historicism, but between two different kinds of historicism. I think that is a more accurate way of putting it. So what are these two kinds of historicism? Well, on the one hand, there is a historicism that is indeed more structural, if you will, because it focuses on explaining how multiple different historical phenomena are united by common underlying structural pressures, right? So in that sense, it is more structural. Fine. Now, on the other hand, there is an institutional historicism, is how I call it in the paper. And this kind of historicism is more focused on how context-specific institutions refract broad structural pressures into divergent historical outcomes, right? So in a sense, you could see it as a matter of different emphasis on what they are trying to explain. I think quite important thing to bear in mind is that the divide between these two historicisms is not really an insurmountable gulf, but rather an epistemic spectrum. And I think that most political Marxists could be plotted somewhere along the spectrum between structural and institutional historicism. Now, most political Marxists are probably somewhere in between, but Nafo and Teschke are on the far end of the institutional wing of the spectrum. And I think that this explains their heightened perception of the divide, but also why so many respondents in the symposium have denied that the divide exists to begin with. So that was the first thing to keep in mind. And my second point was that Nafo and Teschke's radical historicism is therefore not taking the tradition back to its origins, to its historicist roots, as they claim, but rather it is charting new ground on political Marxism's institutional extreme. And their drive to do so, I think, has more to do with their own intellectual development than with the evolution of political Marxism, right? So Teschke's work is on geopolitics, and Nafo's work is on finance. And by contrast, much of political Marxism is about production. Now, finance and geopolitics are obviously related to capitalist production, but the relationship can be quite oblique sometimes. So the existence of a market imperative to increase productivity does not always hold clear answers about these phenomena, about why finance evolves in a particular way, or about how geopolitical strategies develop in a particular direction. So I think that given that the role of production and productivity doesn't always hold a clear answer for their own work, they've come to downplay the importance of concepts like these in the political Marxist framework. And then finally, the third point for Nafo and Teschke, the concept of market dependence is at the root of political Marxism's deterministic relapse. And their claim is that it has become a shortcut to explain a lot of things by reference of something as generic as market dependence, which is the structural pressure to engage in market exchange for survival, right? So their claim is that there's just so much that you can explain with something as broad as that, right? However, I mean, I would agree with that. Broadly speaking, I'm quite critical of the concept of market dependence. I've written about this. However, I'm quite wary of the methodological suggestions that Nafo and Teschke have come to suggest as an alternative. So they're essentially, the way I see it, calling for dissolving political Marxism's conceptual framework into a sort of genealogy of productivity enhancing practices, right? Of tracing these lineages of institutional diffusion, and I think that could be quite problematic, right? So I agree that that market dependence has a lot of problems, and I would welcome a more concrete, practical focus. But I just don't think that reducing political Marxism to a sort of simple analysis of institutional diffusion is the solution, right? Why? Because the spread of productivity enhancing practices under capitalism is contingent, as Nafo and Teschke point out, but it is also not random, right? The modern drive to increase the productivity of labor would be unintelligible without a historically unprecedented sense of imperative, right? Of you need to competitively increase output or perish. So this reality would be flattened out if we got rid of concepts like market dependence or the market imperative in favor of an analysis of institutional genealogies. And this is why, even though I'm critical of these concepts, I still think that they remain absolutely central to political Marxism and Marxism more broadly. Why not?
Rob, do you want to give us your counterpoints?
Well, it's not so much a counterpoint. It's kind of a response to some of what Myra said, and then hopefully like a setup for the broader discussion. And obviously, I'm aware that I've been given the most dangerous task of all of these things, and I'm going to have an angry mob of political Marxists chasing me down the street with flaming torches after this. But the idea is essentially just to give a kind of overview of some of the criticisms that have been made of political Marxism as an intellectual project, and then think through a little bit kind of like why they're there and why they're at. So I think one thing that we ought to mention right at the outset, and has already become clear from what both Maya and Javi have said, is that to speak of political Marxism at times is a problem, because in some ways it's a relatively heterogeneous movement of people who bear some loose resemblance or allegiance to Bob Brenner, but who go off in very different directions. So even someone like Ellen Woods, I think we can in many respects differentiate her from some of the stuff that Bob Brenner would say, and of course like Nafo and Teshki again is a whole different like kettle of fish. So I'm going to talk at a relatively like fuzzy level just to give through some of those examples, and then hopefully in our ensuing discussion we can work some of that out. So I wanted to basically think of like two different ways that we could come at this. Like first the kind of historical transition debate stuff, and then secondly more conceptual questions. Now I'm not going to go too deep into the historical debates because I assume that anyone listening to me just talk about history for like however long will like jump off a cliff or something like that. So we'll just be very quick about it. One of the major things that I think that has come out in kind of recent engagements with political Marxism is how it relates to critiques of Eurocentrism and to the kind of the tradition. Because of course, one of the crucial arguments that Brenner is making is to do with the kind of geographical and geospatial origins of capitalism. And it's important to say, right, that when we think back to Brenner, one thing he's doing is arguing with Dobb, but another big thing that he does right early on is argue very strongly with like Wallerstein and with Gunder Frank. And he wants to say, no, against you guys who have an expansive idea of like a capitalism which grows out of what he calls commercialization and therefore outside of Europe, he is insisting much more about social property relations inside, particularly of England. And so obviously a lot of more recent work and earlier work too has contested this and has sought to try and draw attention back to Europe's expansion into the kind of its non-European peripheries and the role of kind of non-European social formations in contributing to and maintaining capitalist social relations. So that's one kind of big historical critique which has come out. And we can think of, world systems theory, Alex Nyavis's and Kerem Iskangolu's recent work, all of which is contributing to that. So a second kind of big thing that has come up very often is around this historical idea of market dependence. And obviously one of the core arguments that is made in the kind of political Marxist tradition is that this market dependence is crucial in explaining the transition of peasants into workers. And something that a lot of people have argued, Neil Davidson argued it a lot, is this idea that actually that maybe overstates the case, and that actually many people involved in agrarian work, peasants or whatever, voluntarily chose to enter into market relations, not out of market dependence or out of kind of some dull economic compulsion, but because nobody wants to be a peasant. It's really bad. Like, you don't want to do it. So that will be another kind of historical critique. And then obviously there's a kind of blurring of the historical and conceptual critique, which is to do with to what degree does something like commercialization, merchants' capital, and how that works out in other social formations not contribute to a kind of capitalist thing. So those are three, I think, broad historical critiques which are important, and they link importantly with, I think, some broader theoretical points, which I think link back to what Maya and Javi have both said. So the first thing is, and of course we don't want to get into this too much, is this idea about what capitalism is, right? Now, of course, that can become an incredibly inane and boring debate about semantics, but it is obviously politically important for us to understand where capitalism came from, where it's going, and if we think about what it is, what's its logic. So Charlie Post often refers to political Marxism as capital-centric Marxism, right? That's his kind of like, don't insult me, I'm going to call it this instead thing. And one of the issues that we might raise about that is that insofar as political Marxism is centered on capital, I would argue it's primarily centered on Capitalism Capital Volume 1, and less so Volumes 2 and 3. Because 2 and 3 really widen out and broaden out Marx's idea about what capitalism is a totality. Labor, the direct relationship between labor and capital drops out to some degree when we get into stuff about average rates of profits, redistribution, the role of finance, and all this kind of thing. And crucially, and this comes back to the market dependence point, what we also see as a crucial element in Marx's understanding of capitalism is intercapitalist competition as one of the major things which compels productivity. So Javi was just saying, like, well, market dependence and labor productivity, how does that work? And of course, Marx's argument is because capitalists compete with each other, that is a kind of pressure in the whip, which is what generates this drive for labor productivity. So not simply the relationship between labor and capital or that, but actually the relationship of these competing capitals. And that is where you get this one of more like circular thing whereby the profit point comes back in more strongly, because it's this combination of competition and of course labor and the search for profit, which is what pushing it that way. So that's kind of one thing. Now, I think that then comes back into this idea about, well, how is it that we determine or work out like what's capitalist? So one thing that Maya said that I thought was interesting, right, is like she talked about this idea of purely capitalist. But of course, what people would push back on is to say, well, what does that really mean, right? Like, at least in Marx's understanding, he always understood capitalism as this kind of like like pushed together weird contradictory social formation with the continual search for profit via capital accumulation at the forefront and other things drawn into it. And really importantly, right, one of the key things that you get out of reading Marx and other things like that is that the relationship between non-capitalist or pre-capitalist social formations and capitalism is not straightforward and not simple. Very often things that we think of as not being capitalist social relations, when they're drawn into a world market, which has the profit motive at the core of it, they can end up being captured within the logic of capital and contributing towards that. That's also really important because, of course, the thing is, capitalists are strictly indifferent from where various things come from. So an interesting thing that Marx says in like volume 2, I think, is that, well, it's complicated to talk about slavery because slavery was so inserted into the capitalist world market that it began to be governed to some degree by the rhythms and logic of that world market. And of course, the capitalists, they didn't really care if it was produced by slaves or produced by anyone else. They just wanted it as an input into their profit-making practices. So there was that thing going on. That's sometimes addressed under the rubric of uneven and combined development, but I hate uneven and combined development, so I'm not going to talk about that. So then the other question then is this role of coercion. And this is partly where I would maybe to some degree draw a line between Ellen Maitson-Wood and Robert Brenner. Because Maitson-Wood's formulation of the separation of the political and the economic, and this idea that what capitalism is marked by is forms of economic compulsion as opposed to direct coercion, is in some sense, like, I think a distillation of what Brenner says, but he never formulates it quite so boldly as that. Now, I think that is a real problem, that particular formulation, for several reasons. So firstly, it's very straightforward if you look at like actually existing capitalism, and I think we all agree it's capitalism, that coercion continues to play an absolutely central role in labor processes and in forms of accumulation. And again, capitalists are pretty indifferent as to whether or not they're using violence or not. I mean, if you, for instance, would like read Ashok's work on like what happens in garment factories and all these kind of things, you cannot understand what's going on in terms of relations of labor without direct forms of state coercion intervening in processes of like production and reproduction in ways that we have to take seriously to understand contemporary capitalism. And if we go back to the history of capitalism, of course, and this is where the kind of dispute over the Eurocentrism thing might come in, capital accumulation has always been associated with pretty direct forms of violent coercion continually throughout capitalism's existence. So what does that say about a definition of capitalism which insists upon this separation if we see it coming here? And that also then, I think, brings us in this broader question. And again, this is something that's interestingly addressed in the symposium we might want to think about, is, well, what does this mean about the role of the state? Because, of course, the state has been absolutely central to processes of capital accumulation. And not always just in this kind of standoffish way, but very often directly and violently intervening in order to guarantee and maintain relations of capitalist accumulation, right? So all of this to me comes out most significantly in the question of what political Marxism says about imperialism. So Ellen Maitson-Wood writes her book on imperialism, which I do not like very much at all. And part of the big problem with that is that she wants to distinguish between capitalist imperialism proper and these pre-capitalist modes of imperialism. And she wants to do that by saying capitalist imperialism proper is based on non-coercive, non-direct coercion. It's based on market relations. And pre-capitalist imperialism isn't. I've got to say, a look at the kind of, like, firstly, the historical Marxist tradition of thinking of imperialism, but also the historical record, it starts to look very strange that, like, the major emergent capitalist powers combined that with direct forms of coercion and intervention. So Wood looks at the British Empire, and she talks about how Ireland is the example of capitalist imperialism because it, transformed the social relations in land, but then says, well, but not Indian colonialism. This, I think, becomes a problem because it's like, well, why is this such a significant part of these states going on, right? this becomes even more significant when we think that, okay, she argues essentially that post-45 is when you get capitalist imperialism proper. But if you look at what all of the major capitalist powers were saying about their colonies post-45, they weren't like, hey ho, it's time to do some lovely capitalist imperialism. They were like, we are going to fight tooth and nail to maintain our hold on these territories until we basically get forced by the combined action of the national liberation movements and the Soviet Union. So if we're saying that that's part of the logic of capitalism, that separation, we need an explanation for why actually existing powerful capitalist states weren't willing to do that. The kind of exception people might make is in relation to the United States, but that's not even true because so many projects of US accumulation were articulated through direct forms of violent coercion. If you just look at the relationship to the United States in Latin America and the Caribbean, this was a combination of these kind of more benign forms with direct military intervention. And we see that today, right? So if we look, we can trace in various contexts the way in which violent imperialist coercion isn't running counter to projects of capitalist accumulation. It's actually central to them. And part of the important thing about that, and then like I'll wrap up in a second, but part of the important thing about that is that this is also where intercapitalist competition comes back in, right? Because one of the reasons that we see so much military coercion is because capitalists, in alliance with their states, are often in competition with other capitalist powers because capitalism is not smooth like that, which does tend to say that I would say to talk about the separation of political and economic in this context misses something. So finally, and then the final point I want to make, and this I think is more of a thing to think about than anything else, is that one of the things that has been very absent from a lot of political Marxist debates is what the relationship between other articulations of oppression and class are, right? So how does capitalism relate to race and racism? How does it relate to like sexism, gender, like issues of gender, issues of like ableism and all these kind of things? Now, there's a very, I think, bad formulation by Anna Maitsins-Wood, who is basically like, hey, look, class is the only significant thing that you couldn't get rid of in relation to capitalism, and everything else is not necessary to it. I don't think that that's a very good formulation, and I think that it runs against the grain of what a lot of, I think, interesting Marxist work is saying about how the ways in which the logic of capital accumulation and capitalism are tied into the generation of these forms of oppression in these categories. And there's been some attempt to think that through, right? Like Charlie Post like jumps out as a person that's trying to do this on race and racism, but that's largely not being done, and it all then has to be, I think, rooted back in this idea of that particular mode of like how the surplus is extracted, which is useful, but I think does then miss out on the kind of broader social reproductive processes and other processes which go up in making up capitalism outside of that. So I think that would be then to me what some of the kind of core themes that I have seen and thought about in relation to these kind of critiques of political Marxism. And I think the symposium in some ways is actually going on to address those kind of questions too. And I think that's something that, is an important thing for us to talk about and think about.
Great, thank you, Rob, for that. So we can start having a bit more of a kind of open general discussion now. So anyone feel free to chip in as well. I guess the first question I think we should address, and Rob, you've been alluding to kind of part of the answer to this, I think, in what you were just saying, but is to start with this provocative quote from Neil Davidson, who I think I'm not exaggerating by saying that he's very critical of this tradition. He's saying he basically labeled political Marxism as academic sectarianism detached from any socialist practice. So the question from somebody like him might have been, well, it's all well and good. These debates are interesting. They're interesting from an academic point of view. If you work in a university, what is the kind of political purchase they have today? So what do they mean for socialist practice, for the kind of social struggles that are important today? Do they have any importance, or is this just a purely academic debate? And then there's a secondary question, which is that a problem? But firstly, do they have it? What do they have to say?
I have so much respect for Neil's work and historically and politically, etc. But I think that quote is a bit unfair, to say the least. So and I think there's a bit of tongue in cheek, and Neil was very close friends with people in political Marxism, and so it was one of these healthy debates, and this is something that we also try and raise a bit in the symposium, that we can disagree quite fundamentally on some of these semantic and what could be quite sectarian issues actually, but broadly we're on the same we're on the same team, right? So I think, okay, of course, aspects of this are academic more than they are practical. But why do I think political Marxism is still crucial for practical political questions? It's at its core, it tells us that capitalism is inherently um, uh, contingent in many ways, right? It is not an inevitable process. And I know that seems like a simple point, but it's a point that even among Marxists we have to repeat constantly, right? And this will relate back to issues that Rob was saying about Eurocentrism, but also trade and commerce, and a lot of the work today, which is not often not Marxist, on commodities, the specific retracing the history of modernity and of the last few hundred years through specific commodities, or looking at very specific processes across various empires, and there's been great work on this, but it's also been work that's been quite theoretically weak in actually telling us the specificities of what capitalism is. And there's something about being able to pinpoint specific mechanisms and the specific role of the state and various institutions, other than the kind of the usual suspects, in reproducing problematic mechanisms. And various forms of oppression, to also come back to some of the things that Rob was saying. So, on a very basic practical level, political Marxism says that, this is not a system that is everywhere. And in a way, it rejoins what Rob was saying about, that capitalism is constantly in flux, it's constantly contested. There are various processes inside capitalism that are not necessarily capitalist, and it englobes those processes, and we tend to have this very then homogeneous approach to it, which is problematic. And I think I read the work of political Marxists as trying to fight against that in many ways, and to not have this kind of idea that everything that is capitalist is necessarily therefore of the same source and agency. So there's something there about just accepting that capitalism is not going to stay, and let's hope anyway, and that transitions are happening on an everyday level to some extent, and that it is possible to be much more specific about them. So that's kind of taking the discussion more in the terms of the future, but I think it's there as well. There is that, to come back to what Javi was saying about methodology, right, and to move away a bit. I think a lot of what's in the symposium agrees with what Rob was saying, and a lot of the problems. The whole point is it's saying that the work of Ellen Wood and Robert Brenner was problematic in many ways. It was groundbreaking, but it also said a lot of problematic things. It simplified a lot of issues, especially kind of large scale analysis of imperialism. I mean, the book on empire is tiny, right, Rob? So it's there's so much we could pick out of that is problematic, and people have. So it's about moving away from that and taking the discussion on a methodological terrain, which and allows us to bring in a much more rich array of analysis of how capitalism expanded in various locales and contexts. So yeah, but I'll come back on other specific points later, because there's so much of rich and interesting points to come back to here.
All right. So, firstly, I think that there's not a straight line that you can ever trace between intellectual production and political action. If we look at the history of the Marxist tradition, things that you might not have thought would be important politically have turned out to be incredibly important politically. So I don't think that you can make a critique that goes in that way. Secondly, at the point in the kind of historical cycle of resistance in which we're in, at least in like, the advanced capitalist countries, that is basically what everyone is doing. No one is like Lenin producing theoretical work which is instantly informing revolutionary practice. Like, most people's political practice is far and away from the grand historical practices that we would think of the socialist and communist movements. And so I just think that to say that particularly about political Marxism is a bit weird when you could literally say about everyone who you're friends with, essentially. The third point, and I think this is the important point, is that actually you can see several kind of concrete political like payoffs alongside the ones that Maya has already said from what political Marxism brings to you. And you can see this from the kind of political practices that many of the people involved in political Marxism have been about. And this is for good or for ill. So the first thing is, at least classically, people like Brenner and others have said, look, a core part of socialist politics, because of how we understand like social property relations, is a focus on the workplace as an agency and a site of struggle, because we understand that to be one of the core defining features of capitalism. And lots of people who are political Marxists are also people who are like, well, we need to recenter the workplace as a site of political action. The second thing is, again, very specifically, in terms of the critique of neo-Smithian Marxism that someone like Brenner was talking about, that was a direct political intervention. It was a direct political intervention against Gunther Frank and Immanuel Wallerstein, people who were literally formulating political positions and programs for the Third Worldist movement. So this was a direct political intervention with direct implications. I don't agree with those implications, but you can't deny that they are in fact political implications of the project. So alongside the kind of, I think, important things that Maya has identified, although I think you don't need to do political Marxism to think that capitalism is contingent, but I take that point, there are quite concrete political positions that come out of the intellectual positions taken. And finally, look, Marx, one of the important things about the Marxist tradition as opposed to a generic tradition in the workers' movement is the importance of being self-reflexive about the social relations in which you find themselves, because without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. So the simple project of seeking to understand capitalism, how it works, and what it does always has the potential to be political and has always been a core part of a Marxist political program. And I don't think that you can write that off. Of course, the social location of people doing that work in universities makes us all depressed and sad, but that does not automatically undermine the possibility of the fact that understanding capitalism is important for any political action.
Thanks, Rob. Javi, you've been itching to respond.
To what extent does political Marxism inform political activity? I mean, I think as Rob, you yourself were pointing out, right? To what extent does, I don't know, value theory, Marxist, new reading, things like that, to what extent do they inform socialist strategy or something like that? I don't know. Can you do that? Like in a context in which it's not revolutionary, right? Like, to what extent do we have an expectation that Marxist theory should be directly informing revolutionary activity, right? I don't know if that's something it's a bit too much to ask for, perhaps in the context that we're living. I will say though that I don't know if broad Marxist theoretical traditions are supposed to have a direct link with practice. I think that in the case of political Marxism, the way I see it, right, everyone that I know that works within this tradition is involved in some form of political activity, but it sort of creates the space for people to use the theory in very different ways, right? Like, I know, there's obviously people from some of the main figures of political Marxism have been related to different strands of the Trotskyist movement, but then there's also like left communists that I know of. I know of anarchists that use political Marxism to inform their practices. So I think it's quite diverse. I wouldn't expect the narrative that political Marxism has of capitalism to sort of correlate directly with any specific political sect, if you will. But it is precisely for that reason that the accusation that political Marxism is sectarian, that I find that like sort of puzzling, right? Because I'm not really sure what is sectarian about political Marxism. Is it just that it disagrees with even in combined development? I mean, because that's just a disagreement. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing comparable to a Marxist sect in that sense. So I just don't quite understand the criticism of sectarianism. I think when Neil Davidson made it, as Maya was pointing out, I think it was more of a tongue-in-cheek comment, and I don't think it really expanded much on it. So I wouldn't like focus too much on that. should I move on to conceptual issues or? Yep. Okay, so I think Rob has done an excellent job in lining up the main criticisms of political Marxism, and I think he's really hitting on some really crucial issues. However, political Marxists themselves have also been inquiring on these same issues, right? And sometimes when we look at these criticisms, we always do it from the outside and not take into account the work that political Marxists themselves have been doing to work through these problems, which are indeed very much real, right? So, okay, so for example, the question of market dependence, right? That was one of the things you started. I mean, that's just a massive point of contention within political Marxism, right? The Brenner Wood debate on the Dutch transition was about the concept of market dependence. I've written about this. I don't think it's helpful to use it as a way to disentangle transitions to capitalism, for example. And it's precisely for the reason that you're pointing out and that Neil Davidson was raising, which is that, you know, economic actors before capitalism voluntarily engaged in market exchange, and that sometimes subsumed them in conditions of dependence. Therefore, market dependence is not particularly helpful to sort of like trace transitions to capitalism, even though it's a necessary element of capitalism nevertheless, right? Now, the way that Brenner formulated it originally, it meant that it was, I suppose, trying to juxtapose conditions of subsistence farming with sort of an imperative to introduce capital using and labor saving methods in agriculture, and saying that the more that peasants sort of started producing for the market, the more they sort of became sucked into this spiral in which they had to invest more capital and save more labor, and therefore that sort of like set in motion a dynamic of capitalist economic development. And I think that's just not true. You know, I think that I would say probably most political Marxists, at least those who are working on questions of transition to capitalism, will recognize that market dependence is just simply insufficient to explain the story, because when you look at it, subsistence farming is a well-known misnomer, right? Peasants that have been in possession of the means of production have engaged in market exchange and have been dependent on commercial exchange to various degrees for thousands of years. I would say that is the historical norm in the Eurasian continent, at least. And so, we're talking about, peasants who were family farmers, but they had to buy, I don't know, seeds, pay rents, hire people for the harvest, something like that. Now, if you cannot meet these payments, you might lose your land. That could happen, right? So there were conditions of market dependence before capitalism came about, granted. So that is clear. To me, it's the market imperative that is more determinant, right? And now the market imperative can only happen in conditions of market dependence, right? But it is the imperative, and it's the imperative to systematically increase the productivity of labor or be driven out of business, essentially. So it's that sort of like social standard of productivity that market competition imposes on the producer. So I think that's probably where most political Marxists are at this point, but maybe I'm talking a bit too much for others. There is the question about competition that you were raising as well. Well, I don't see that as a criticism of political Marxism, because that is precisely what political Marxism says, right? That is that it's not just a matter of relations of exploitation of capital and labor, a sort of like vertical relationship of capital exploiting labor. It is the imperative to compete on the market that drives the compulsion to increase productivity. And that has always been at the heart of political Marxism. So I don't just see that as a contradiction at all. In fact, Brenner calls this a horizontal relation, right? It's not just vertical class relations, it's horizontal class relations. And if anything, I think Brenner probably privileges the horizontal aspect even more than the vertical one. So just something to keep in mind. The idea that capitalism is made up of contradictory social formations with different modes of production, just an assemblage of different institutions unevenly, that they're held together haphazardly. To me, that is, I think political Marxism is better than other Marxist traditions at understanding that. So I would refute the idea that political Marxism just can't deal with these sort of contradictions. I mean, when you look at something like, for example, world systems theory, right? Sometimes it's really hard for people in that tradition to look at capitalism as anything less than a global totality, right? They tend to look at a social formation through the prism of geopolitical dynamics, but often without taking into account the domestic dynamics of that social formation, in detail, right? So to me, and often it gets really hard to sort of say things like, okay, well, maybe slavery was fundamental for the growth of British capitalism, but you can question whether slavery itself was operating according to a capitalist logic, right? For someone working in that tradition, that is just all one thing and the same, it's really hard to, that very question might seem really hard to even grapple with. Like, of course, it's just a capitalist world system. There's nothing less, nothing more. But then when you're looking at the transition to capitalism, it is self-evident that capitalism didn't come about, at once everywhere the same, right? It unfolded unevenly in a contradictory manner. It spread in different ways in different places. And that's something that political Marxism and its focus on social property relations tries to take seriously. Now, the idea that different social forms that may not take the form of the capital-labor relation, once they become drawn into the world market, can take the form of capitalism. I also do not see that as a contradiction with where political Marxism is at the moment, right? Sometimes political Marxism gets caricatured a little bit by saying that we only focus about, it's all about wage labor, it's all about the rise of wage labor. It's just simply not true. I mean, when you look at the Brenner thesis is about how peasants who were in possession of the means of production, right, family farmers, started competing with one another for leases of land, and that's what set in train capitalist development. And when you look at the work of Brenner and Wood, their argument is that, a mass proletariat was a consequence of this dynamic rather than the precondition that made it happen, right? That in fact, these early farmers didn't even employ much wage labor. And in fact, if you look at the history of wage labor, you'll find instances of it on a mass scale in the Roman Empire, for example. That's not capitalism, but capitalism does bring about mass proletarianization. It is a consequence of it. And some might say, although not everyone would argue within political Marxism, that wage labor is perhaps the form of exploitation that is most conducive towards productivity increases, hence its importance. But it's not the only one, right? And I'll just give you another example. Slavery, for example, is a debate within political Marxism whether US slavery was capitalist or not, right? Not everyone agrees on that issue. So Charles Post, notably, thinks that the US plantations in the 19th century were not capitalist, and that the US Civil War was essentially a war between modes of production. But then most recently, someone like John Clegg has made the opposite case, that actually, insofar there was a liquid market for slaves, the capitalist in charge of a plantation was increasing the productivity of labor just as any other capitalist would have done. So John Clegg comes from political Marxism and is making a case that US plantations were indeed a form of capitalism. So as you can see, you can take the tradition in many different directions. There is no one clear-cut answer to these questions. It's just that political Marxists take the history seriously and then they sort of draw conclusions accordingly. I think that's the only thing.
Cool. Thanks, Avi. Sven, did you want to say something about what you had in mind about academic concerns?
I wanted to maybe make one point, but first I wanted to say that I was a bit resistant to join because I said to you, Ashok, before, I'm really not a political Marxist, and so take the comments I make as that, but also I'm glad I joined after all, because I think I just now understood something that happened to me when I first came to political Marxist literature, and coming at it from a kind of question of on the conceptual or in the conceptual realm. I was interested in a question of how do we think politics in a Marxist materialist sense. And I came to the work and I didn't find an answer and I left again. And I think now I have two kind of explanations of that. One is that the capital-centric Marxism label that Post gave to parts of it is what I think I looked at and what I found, and which is maybe also, one of my broader questions is a little bit, don't we need to center a kind of, and in that sense I have quite a lot of sympathy with Nafo and Teschke, don't we need to center questions of institution and questions of the state? I mean, that what like Heide Gerstenberger also raised in the symposium. Wouldn't we need to center that more as also problems in and of themselves that we cannot necessarily always explain through these kinds of overarching logics that we've now talked about quite a lot? So I can understand why I now felt I didn't quite get what I came for, but I also can see that maybe I had to look at other parts of political Marxism in order to find the answer to my question, and maybe I will do that later on. But what I wanted to speak to was kind of Neil Davidson's provocation, and I wanted to do that by coming back a little bit to the initial contribution to the symposium that Nafo and Teschke made, because to me, as an outsider, it read not just as a kind of polemic within political Marxism, but it read also as a contribution on the very question of Marxist method, of the materialist method. And I liked how in the introduction, Maya, you kind of pulled that out and suggested that maybe one of the questions they are asking all of us is how do we consciously develop our conceptual apparatuses, and how do we actually kind of own up to the methodological commitments that we make often implicitly in our work. And for Nafo and Teschke, it seems to me that their concern is very much with this question of systematicity. So what is, or what can be a systematic relation between theory and history? And more broadly, this kind of issue of how we deal with overcoming liberal or autonomous accounts of political logics on the one side and economic logics of the other. And I don't think that's a unique problem to political Marxism. I think that's a problem for kind of all Marxists who want to, in one sense, work on questions of politics or ideology from a historical materialist method. And it seems to me that, and I'm quite enjoying what Neil Davidson maybe calls sectarianist or non-political, but I think we need to have these kinds of debates about method. And it seems to me that the difficulty that Nafo and Teschke kind of work through in their account, and this demand, where they come to a demand for a return to historicism in the end, might be actually an expression of something that is a difficulty for historical or Marxist materialism in general. And maybe it speaks to the fact that, and I want to kind of maybe polemically suggest that Marxist materialism is possibly as a method an impossible place to inhabit. Precisely because, at least to me, I think it doesn't allow for a systematic answer to their question. So we cannot, I think, find a once and for all answer to the question, where should we stand between history and structure, because we will always fall into idealism, especially if we present it as an antinomy, as a kind of antinomial relationship between the two. And my kind of resolution that I would propose, and I will kind of betray some Althuserian roots here maybe, but I think what we need to do is we need to submit this very question always again and again to the conjuncture. And I think our answer can only in a way be a speculative one rather than a systematic one around this question of the relation between history and class struggle on the one side and structure on the other. Because I think they are very Kantian in their initial text that gave rise to the symposium, in this kind of demand. And then in the response, they write, we should have more faith in our political judgment than to rely on abstract rules as our moral compass. And I think that's exactly what they don't want. I think that's exactly what they problematize in the initial proposition. So in one sense, I'm saying something that is very old. I'm saying we need to be more speculative in our appreciation of the problem of a Marxist method and of these kinds of decisions, because I don't think they are polar, and I also don't think that we can make them outside of situating ourselves within the analysis of a very specific conjuncture where the question of structure and the question of history and class struggle will come into a specific relationship between them. And I will stop by just kind of raising something else that I found a really interesting question. And again, Maya, it's something you raised, and I don't know, you might have raised it in passing, but I found it really interesting. You said, is it maybe part of our capitalist reason to wanting to always hang on to a kind of, or to let ourselves be derailed into too much of a structuralist account of things? And again, I think this is a methodological question. It's an epistemological question as well as an ontological question a little bit, namely, how does our account of historical development, how do we understand ourselves as objects rather than subjects of this theorizing, and also how does it relate to questions of ontology, namely what the very ontology of a capitalist society or capitalist societies is. And in that sense, Javier, I'm kind of maybe also taking a little bit, because you said it's an epistemological question. I don't know, actually. I wonder, whether we don't need to kind of confront an ontological question about how we or whether we need to at least be open, whether we can make an ontological statement about the development of capitalism and the relationship to kind of a contradictory or dialectical development. So that was just something I would maybe like throw back to Neil Davidson and kind of maybe say this is something that is very valuable in the way it's been raised in a somewhat abstract manner in this initial text of the symposium. And I guess one answer, and that's maybe an answer some of you gave earlier, is that, well, political Marxism itself was a polemical gesture, right? And very often, I think our methodological answers or decisions are polemical ones, because we think the stick has been bent too far into economic determinism, too far into structuralism. So we want to bend the stick back. And again, it's only a polemical. So I think this question of can we inhabit the space of method other than as in a polemical way, or is that something we should embrace, is a really interesting question. The symposium raised for me. Yeah, and maybe, I don't know, can I throw one question to Javier? Because one, or to all of you actually, doesn't have to, but that came out to me from reading your contribution. Around the long dominance of capitalism. So I was wondering, these kinds of shifts within political Marxism, or, that Nafo and Teschke are diagnosing in a way and problematizing. Isn't there a way that we need also an account of what the long dominance of capitalism that we have experienced until today, has that, or does that have to have an effect on our theorizing and on our kind of positioning, and has that maybe had an effect on Brenner in the way that Nafo and Teschke presented as a theoretical problem, but is that also maybe a response to how Brenner himself maybe understands the effects that the structure of capitalism has had? So that, yeah, I think it's a question to all of you. I don't know why.
Thanks, Tanya. I'm going to ask Maya to respond, and then Javi.
Thanks, and yeah, especially Svenja, that was really good. And I'm going to try and kind of speak to some of the points you were making and going through them at the same time in my head. That, to try and Javi was great in giving some really specific points there about recent PM work and what's, the debates and questions that people in this tradition have been tackling. But my role a bit in the symposium was to try and look at the bigger picture and to try and also be a bit of an outsider in the way that Svenja has been doing here. And my way of looking at it is like, well, what does political Marxism bring to us, right? We're all, starting from the same point. We're trying to understand what the hell is going on in the world. We're trying to understand how we can get out of capitalism. What does political Marxism bring me? It tells me that comparative work, a specific kind of comparative work, is really important to how we go about analyzing these things. And that's a methodological choice, right? And that any Marxist enterprise, any Marxist project, research project, is a question of choices, of compromises, right? And you're never going to get the whole picture. You're never going to be able to present everything that's going on, as much as it is the theory that tries to do that the most. And that's why we love it, right? We want this thing to explain everything. But the point is, that we're going to have to make some of these choices, and the choices that political Marxism, I guess, helped me make is focusing on specific aspects of the transition in specific contexts, specific aspects of what happened in England, which were really key to understand what was not happening in other contexts, right? So Brenner wrote his thesis in relation to other parts of Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well, right? Why were lords in France, in Eastern Europe, not responding the same way as they were in England? And that's the key question, right? What was specific to England for these specific things to happen there differently to where they happened anywhere else, right? So what we need to do today is do something similar. And if you look at all the work that's happening on commercial capitalism, for example, right? Jairus Banaji's work, and that is, a kind of stark contrast to, I guess, some of the political Marxist arguments, and this idea that some of which Rob was raising about trade and commercialization, and this focus on circulation, right? And that capitalism emerged in loads of different places and loads of different pockets because wage labor did exist in other contexts before it existed in England, of course, right? They were putting out systems, there were manufacturers, there were, small kind of bosses that were working in ways that were forcing producers in specific ways. However, those were not generalized, right? And if we take a view of capitalism that focuses on just these various little instances everywhere, we have a very different picture. And that, if you want to do that, that's fine. That's a choice. But you have to be honest about what then consequences those methodological choices have for the way in which you analyze history on a larger scale. Right, and that's, I guess, the point I'm making is that it's not about the fight of who's going to win, who knows exactly how it happened. It's about being honest about the choices that you're making historically and what that entails, and being and tracing that development in your work. Right, so I'm interested in, for example, legal aspects of these transitions and other pre-capitalist and capitalist processes, and focusing on actors that have been ignored in political Marxism and other aspects of Marxism, and that helps to give us a richer picture of different things going on. So that's a bit links a little bit back to what I think Svenja was saying about method, about needing to do more work. So coming back to the interesting work by Banaji, Lali Khalili, Adam Hanye today, looking at logistics, looking at maritime factors, work by Collas and Campling that's just come out on capitalism and the sea. All this stuff needs to be discussed, compared, contrasted to the stuff that's coming out with political Marxism. These are not separate traditions, right? We do need to work together and do more comparative work of how these things compare, and that's what I would like the future to look like, and to think of all these different aspects of circulation and production and why we've been separating them, and how empirically I think we agree on many points. That's the joke of it, right? And Collas and Campling make that point to some extent, that this juncture is much more analytical than empirical, and our work is to kind of go back to the empirical links there between these different histories of capitalism. The other point I just want to make that links back to Svenja's commentary is on subjectivity. Right, that's the elephant in the room here. We talk about agency in the symposium a lot, and each piece, and it's I think what we're not discussing, and we're not discussing enough in political Marxism, is subjectivity at a very conceptual level, epistemological level, but also at a quite practical, concrete level, and that speaks to Javi's, Rob's points about forms of oppression, right, and different ways in which forms of freedom and unfreedom and labour, but also other forms of capitalist subjectivity and how they influence our issues of method. So that, I think, is definitely something that that we need to bring more to the table and think of agency in richer ways. Again, it's agency structure debate, which is creating more problems than it's solving, right?
Javi, do you want to respond to what Svenja said? Thanks, Maya.
I think that the debate about the origins of capitalism is not really just an antiquarian issue about sort of like getting the details of what peasants did in medieval Europe or something like that, right? It's the question of when capitalism came about is simultaneously the question of what capitalism itself is, right? And that is fundamental for not just political Marxism but any kind of Marxism. So the truth is that many people within and without Marxism, they take what capitalism is for granted, right? They think it means money, it means trade, it means market, it means greed, maybe, and they reduce it to these things which have existed long before capitalism, right? And now, if you're a Marxist, I think you need to take seriously Marx's principle that capitalism is a historically specific society, that it has a specific origin, and therefore it potentially has an end as well, right? If you cannot locate where capitalism began, or are not interested in that question, or if you cannot distinguish capitalism from non-capitalism, you're essentially surrendering that issue, right? And you kind of end up defaulting in a sort of view of capitalism that is quite transhistorical, and eventually you've become subsumed into liberal historiography. I'm sorry, right? Because if capitalism is essentially an extension of trade, of age-old practices, then why start in 1492, for example, which would be the Brenner's critique of Wallerstein, right? The Spanish Empire had a massive head start from England when it comes to plunder, when it comes to genocide, when it comes to like stealing all this stuff and establishing a global commercial empire. Yet was Spain like the sort of cutting edge of economic modernization? I mean, when you look at peasant productivity in Spain in 1910, it was the same it was in the late Roman Empire, right? You can't really sort of make these claims and then sort of not follow through with the logical conclusion. And I think this speaks to Maya's argument about making choices. I think that if you just shrug off the question and you default to the idea that capitalism is about money and markets and trade, like Wallerstein does, or like Banerjee, I think, does as well, at some point you will find yourself locating the origin of capitalism further back in time. And this is something that I see in Banerjee's work, for example. Initially, I don't think he would have done this, but in his latest book, he takes it further back and back. Now the Islamic societies of the Middle Ages were capitalist. And he talks about in other stuff I've read about Roman capitalism, for example. And I don't know why stop there, right? Like Max Weber saw the origin of capitalism in Babylon, literal Babylon, not the metaphoric Babylon. But I just don't think that sort of dissolves the historical specificity of capitalism into any form of sedentary society that has some form of trade, right? And Gunther Frank himself took this to the logical conclusion. He said that the modern world system was 4,000 or 5,000 years old, right? If that is capitalism, it becomes really hard to imagine how to escape it or to overthrow it, right? Because it's essentially the same thing as urban sedentary civilization. So that speaks to the choices. Now, I do think that it's not just a conceptual choice. It's also about explaining modern economic development, right? So when we look at the increases in the productivity of labor that we have witnessed in the last 2 centuries, they are completely historically unprecedented, right? They have changed almost everything that we know about human society. We've gone from peasant societies to proletarian societies with mass urbanization, with mass commercialization, and you can't just flatten that out. And if you choose to see capitalism as purely an extension of trade, that is what happens, essentially.
Thanks, Javi. I'm going to ask Rob to respond, but I just wanted to say on Rob's original contribution, Uh, some of the things that you highlighted were around Wood's intervention in around imperialism, capitalist imperialism. But I think that and then you also made reference to sort of uneven combined development, and also like Alex Anivas's work and his intervention. But Anivas doesn't actually to me isn't really a direct assault on Brenner's thesis on transition. He's actually just, in lots of ways, expanding the scope of it. He's saying, okay, well, what are the global contributing factors to, say, demographic decline or any number of different commercial opportunities and so on and so forth. So in some ways, it's like trying to build estuaries to Brenner's original thesis. And so in some ways, it's not necessarily a kind of intervention in the way that I think that would undermine that thesis. If anything, it's sort of global, like historicizing it, but also expanding it more geographically. And on top of that, when you make the question about a Woods intervention later on around imperialism, is it to say, and I'm curious, I guess this is for everyone, but specifically Rob, is it to say that Brenner's original intervention inevitably leads to Wood's conclusions around imperialism, or is it interpretive? Is it that this is? I mean, it is the case that lots of people who are supporters of political Marxism do sort of vacillate around that question of imperialism and have similar takes on it. But I wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
So on Alex Anivas, I think that will be news to him. I don't think he would be like, oh, great point, I'm extending the tributaries of Robert Brenner. I think he would fairly wholeheartedly disagree with that point. We can say what that means or not. I mean, look, there's a question, but this is what I'm also talking about context and the Gunther Frank stuff and the Wallerstein stuff. Like, in part, Brenner is very specifically insisting on the geographical location of capital. I don't think it's as separable as you think. Like, he could be right or he could be wrong, but I don't. That's one thing. And then the other thing is, look, we can get to a point where it just turns out everyone secretly agrees with each other, because, like, if we nuance everything enough, it just turns out that they agree with each other. It's not good podcasting, but also I actually just don't think that necessarily accurately captures what it is that we're trying to say here. So I wanted to come a little bit back in that front to what Harvey was saying, and then it links in a little bit with Maya. So one thing that you said, and I get this, when you started talking about the expanded research program of political Marxism, you just said, oh, we do good history and then we follow the history. Everyone fucking says that. Like, that is what no one is like, I've done some really bad history in order to prove my point, do they? Like, everyone who would be criticized by political Marxists would defend their historical account. The thing would be, there's no such thing as good history in that sense, because it's a methodological question. It's like, well, what do you bring to the study of history in what way? Because equally, so you say, like, you said, oh, these people might fall foul of being liberal historiography. I would say, if you say you're just doing good history, that's the most liberal sounding historiography I've ever heard in my life. Like, that's what every liberal says. So I think so this is why I think, firstly, about why we have to take seriously these debates about stuff like rules of reproduction and stuff like this. These weren't added extras for, like, Brenner on top of his good historical research. This was him attempting to work through what he thought a Marxism would look like in a certain kind of context. And it's important to consider on that front, right? We don't talk about that much anymore, that, like, Brenner was part of the analytical Marxist circle, and a lot of what he was doing there was trying to work through, but not as terribly as most analytical Marxists, because he actually had political commitments, how he could take some of the kind of claims that Marxists make and translate them into that kind of analytical Marxist language. So the reason I think that's important, right, is I just don't think it's good enough for someone to say we're following the history or it's good history. No, everyone will say that. It's just, instead, it's about, as Maya said, the methodological, and I think importantly on that, political choices that you make. And this is what is, I think, the distinctive thing about Marxism, and what I would think of as the Marxist method, is the move from the abstract to the concrete and then back again, right? Where Marx builds up a unity of a number of historical determinations in such a way as to formulate a set of abstract conceptions of capitalism and then brings them back down to earth in that way. That, to me, is what we can think of as, like, a distinctively Marxist method, right? And the way that Marx does his kind of intellectual production. And so I think and in that sense, I don't disagree, but almost what I'm hearing from you is, I'm like, well, what does it even mean to talk about political Marxism then? If you can essentially depart from, like, what I would have understood, and a lot of people would have understood as, like, the central analytical insights of the political Marxist tradition, at what point? And in which case, that honestly, that's not a problem. Like, that's fine. But that then comes into what we're getting into, right? Where it's like, well, what do we mean by what, and what do we mean by what? This, by the way, I guess is one of my, and this comes back to my this is my particular take on the Nafo and Teshki thing. One of my questions always with the kind of work that they're doing that's agent centered is, and I don't mean this in a sectarian way, I just mean it's a genuine question, like, what is at stake in you calling this Marxist anymore? Like, I don't quite. I've always had I've always been like, okay, if we're talking about a contingent agent centered, I'm not going to say agential, like, account of the ways in which there are these contingent developments and this kind of stuff, I'm like, you don't have to call it Marxism. Like, it feels quite distant from like what a lot of the Marxist tradition says. So I mean, the other thing then is like, I think coming back into this then is like, what are in a sense the politics of demarcating a tradition, and what are the sense of naming a tradition, and what does that mean? And then just on what Ashok said about imperialism, I don't know, man. Like, it's hard to see what's an ineluctable development from anything else, right? But obviously, there is a definite part of the Marxist tradition which encloses imperialist relations as intrinsic to capitalist social relations and intrinsic to the survival of capitalist social relations, in a way which, at least the way that some of Brenner's work goes, it seems inimical. I'm not saying it definitely is, because it's not necessarily definitely that, but it is to say, like, the wood thing is at least a possible derivation from the assumptions of Brenner. And also, in part, with all of this stuff, I think it's important for us to say in any of this, like, I don't think the stakes are about saying, like, whose fault is it. That's not what's interesting. The stakes are like, what is yielded analytically, and what does that tell us about, like, the world? And that, I guess, then, this is my last point, just in relation to something that Maya said. I think, look, the important thing is like, we need that balance of necessity and contingency, because the whole thing, as I understand it, about one of the huge contributions that Marx makes to socialist movement in general is to say, no, this isn't just about you deciding that you can change this and then, like, there's going to be red lemonade in the seas. It's like, capitalism has a logic, it has an internal logic, like, and you need to understand that logic to know where capitalism is weak and where it is strong, and your political action needs to not just be like random, but to have an understanding of where an intervention might go. So if we don't have some understanding of necessity, or I would like say, like, the logic of how capitalism works, we lose our map of where we're politically effective.
Great, thank you, Rob. So before we end, we could just do a final round if anyone wants to say a few final words, either on the symposium or on some of the questions raised, anything that hasn't been addressed.
Yeah, okay, I'll go first. Thanks, Rob and Javi as well here. Okay, what I want to respond to very briefly to close off is one maybe idea for how to kind of speak to what Rob is saying. Let's not just fall into this bland, neutral, we all agree at the end of the day type scenario. Obviously, I don't want to kind of fall into that. So okay, so specifically about the rules of reproduction. Post and La France and those who kind of follow that line, so Smollett and Evans, believe in the rules of reproduction because, and then Post puts it quite well, and I think he got this from Brenner, you've got to be able to distinguish between changes of a system and changes within a system, okay? And that, that's a really neat way to try and say, okay, yeah, everything is agency led, and obviously political Marxism is about agency primarily, but nevertheless, some, capitalism is so specific that we need to know, what gets reproduced, what are these rules, what are the changes of system that we need to look out for, right? And I would say, my position on this will be, well, let's think of it maybe in terms of expansion and origin. And when we look at the origin of capitalism, those rules, those setups, that methodology is going to be different to then if we think about expansion. And a lot of the work today that we've been talking about in terms of trade and circulation is about expansion. It's not necessarily about origin. And those two things get conflated. And I think if we are better at distinguishing whether we're talking about the expansion of capitalism or, specific locales and changes within, then we'll be better set up. Also, it depends, if we're talking pre-capitalism, it's so complex, the various juridical, political, religious, cultural relations that are going on there, that we have to have different ways of looking at it than we do now. Today we have different challenges, right? It's not simpler today, but they're different. So that was just that. But the other very quick point is about just mentioning Pedro Segaldo's work in a symposium and Jessica Evans' work, which really try and push forward the boundaries here in terms of thinking of settler colonialism, of different forms of labour, migrant labour, different forms of indentured labour, how that complicates the stories of origin and expansion in different contexts. And Salgado's work on decolonial theory and issues of Eurocentrism, which I think will be really useful to take these debates forward.
I will use my finishing remarks to respond to Rob for calling me a liberal. So I just want to clarify a number of things. So I am not saying that it's just about getting the history right. All I do is good history, man. And just like, I'm obviously not saying that. So I just want to leave that out clear, right? What I meant was that if political Marxists say that capitalism started in England, it's not because they have an a priori commitment to make England this sort of exceptionalist case, some kind of like civilizational cradle. You know what I mean? Like they start from the premise that there was, something unprecedented, a rupture in the logic of production and productivity that is visible, that is, you can actually trace in the case of English agriculture, and then spreads into industry in the form of the Industrial Revolution, that we need to single out England as a case to be explained, right? Now, it doesn't mean that, we have a commitment to making England special, right? Brenner himself, where he is at right now, is that England, the Netherlands, and Japan had parallel transitions in the early modern period. So clearly, what I'm saying is that it's the empirics sort of, guide the path, and then political Marxism adapts to that, which is not to say that it can just be reduced to the empirics, right? But it's a more historicist project than other sections of Marxism, in that if you want to dispute political Marxism, you're probably be in a better terrain if you take it to the empirical realm, because that can really destabilize sections of the narrative. If you just say, well, like Banaji does, for example, well, there was trade in the Islamic Middle Ages, that, it's kind of, we'll just shrug it off. It's just, okay, fine, whatever. That doesn't really address the question, the theoretical question, I mean. And the same thing could be said about, the exclusion of, I don't know, the colonialism in the emergence of capitalism, right? Like it's not just because like political Marxists want to exclude the experience of non-European peoples. It's because there were many European powers that were engaged in colonialism in different forms of imperialism, and they produced divergent outcomes, right? I'll go back to the Spanish case. You see what I mean? Like how, if colonialism is a sufficient cause to explain the rise of capitalism, why did Spain not become the first capitalist or industrial capitalist nation? Or, you could argue the same thing about France, although I know that people feel differently about the French case. So and having said that, I don't think that the case, the role of colonialism and empire is inimical to the Brenner thesis. I really don't think that's the case. So I'll just clarify one thing about political Marxism, which is that it is evident that English capitalism emerged in the context of a larger trading system and would have not emerged without it. So I'll just say that, and you can quote me on that, because I'm not actually saying this. This is Ellen Wood in The Origin of Capitalism, textual line. I have it written down here, prepared from my notes. So it is evident that we are aware of that. No one in political Marxism is saying that trade did not matter, commercial systems, colonialism, plunder. No one is saying that. It's just a matter of it being insufficient to explain a historical rupture. You see what I mean? So that is that's really the issue here. Now, you might say, well, saying that that colonialism contributed to the growth of English capitalism is insufficient. because colonial slavery was also a form of capitalism. Well, I mean, you can say that, right? But that Eric Williams, who was within the dependency tradition, agreed with that statement. That he would have said that plantation slavery in the Caribbean was fundamental to the story of English capitalism in the metropole, but nevertheless, that form of slavery cannot be really seen as capitalist per se. So in that sense, the idea that some of the arguments of the dependency tradition and the Brenner thesis are inimical is not, I would dispute that. I really don't think that's the case. It's a bit of a caricature, it seems to me. And also, I'm not a liberal.
All right, Rob, do you want to give us the last bits?
I didn't call you a liberal. I said that's a thing that liberals say. I just needed you to clarify. I like whatever. You're not a liberal. Like it's just the statement. I'm just following the history. Is a liberal statement par excellence. That's all I mean.
Great. So on that note, I think we can say thank you to, well, first of all, to the listeners. Hopefully, you enjoyed this first historical materialism podcast and learned something about political Marxism. Thanks very much to our guests, to Maya, to Rob, to Svenja, and to Javier for their excellent contributions and insights.
And so subscribe to the podcast, read the articles on the website, subscribe to the HM Journal, and follow us on Twitter. And if you want to have any questions, you can slide into our DMs at histmat on Twitter. Our next journal, 29.4, is out in December, and so we'll speak to you then.